Knock knock. Something was constantly bothering my son at night. He couldn't fall asleep because of it and kept asking me to lie down next to him. Only then would he begin to drift off. No matter what measures I took, nothing helped my little Dalton. I took him to psychologists and various therapists, but there were no results. Everyone told me that my son was a normal, healthy boy. The problem was that his fits of panic and fear only started at night when I was putting him to bed. He would often twitch in bed, have hysterics, throw his blanket and pillow on the floor, and cry the whole time, begging me not to put him to sleep and not to leave him alone in the room. Every time I tried to find out the reason for this behavior, Dalton remained silent, staring intently at the door with eyes full of terror. Consequently, I would take him to my room to sleep. Only there, with me, did he sleep peacefully. I lived without a husband, and I confess it was often difficult and heavy for me, but I comforted myself with the thought that whatever I did was for my son's well-being and would surely benefit him. One day, during the afternoon, Dalton asked me why I had walked to the basement the previous night and stood there until dawn. He said he had watched me and then went to sleep. I was a bit shocked because on that particular night, neither I nor Dalton was home. I had gone to the city on business and left him with my aunt. I was bewildered by my son's words, but dismissing it as a child's imagination, I didn't give it much thought and told him it was just a dream. Dalton smiled and began happily to finish his pumpkin puree. In the evening, as usual, I was getting my son ready for bed while preparing myself. "Dalty, sweetheart, are you sleeping with me today?" I asked. He gave his approval. Tucking him in and smoothing every corner of the blanket, I kissed the boy on the forehead and stroked his head, telling him I would go brush my teeth and come back. But as I turned to leave, Dalton suddenly grabbed my hand. He began to beg me not to leave the room. I insisted I would be quick, but my son flatly refused to let me go. Then I sat on the bed beside him and in a kind, gentle voice asked what he was so afraid of. He lowered his eyes and grew silent with a sad face. I realized I was unlikely to get an answer and kissed his forehead once more. "Don't be afraid of anything. I'll be quick," I said reassuringly. "Mom, stop!" a loud, sharp voice cried from the bed. "I don't want you to go because if you go, he'll come to me again," Dalton said fearfully. "Who will come?" I decided to ask, sitting back down on the bed. And then my son finally revealed what had been scaring him so much, why he couldn't fall asleep alone and why he feared the solitude. I listened intently, only occasionally asking questions. He spoke timidly and quietly, as if afraid he would be heard by someone else. My son told me he had met a person who only he and perhaps other small children could see. This person had lived here a long time ago, before we moved in. According to my son, this person's fate was tragic. He had hanged himself in this house and soon found a new life, continuing to live here after death. At first, he became like a friend to Dalton. Dalton secretly talked and played with him, sharing childhood secrets. But one day, this person crossed the boundaries at everything sane and reasonable. He began to frighten the boy, coaxing him into all sorts of mischief. He told him about death and the place where people go when they cannot find peace. According to this friend, that world was a dark and cold place where all kinds of people wandered, screaming and constantly begging for help. Soon the man's behavior turned completely wrong. He began coming to my son at night, knocking and scratching at the boy's bedroom door. Sometimes he would enter the room and stand before Dalton's bed, breathing heavily, staring at him with huge eyes. He intimidated him, saying he would kill him and me, that we wouldn't be able to live in this house for long. By the time my son finished his story, I was in a stupor. I doubted the truth of his words, but something made me uneasy. Dalton had described everything in such detail that it sounded more like the truth than a child's invention. To calm him down, I told him that the man was no longer in the house and that it was all just fantasy. The child seemed relieved. He turned away with a smile and fell asleep. Soon I joined him. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Silence filled the house. In my sleep, I heard a dull, distinct ticking in the clock in the hallway. Dalton was sleeping, and so was I. Suddenly, I felt as if something was lightly touching my legs. Moreover, this something was cold. I pulled my leg back, but it began to touch the other one. I pulled that one back too. Half asleep, I decided to open one eye to make sure it was Dalton, But when I did, I saw him lying next to me, sleeping soundly and deeply. Opening both eyes, I stared at Dalton without getting out of bed. I began to slowly scan the room. Literally a split second later, something suddenly tried to drag me off the bed, grabbing me by my legs. I was terrified and began to struggle, clutching the blanket as if it were a lifeboat. Suddenly, I felt a movement at my feet. Slowly turning my head, I saw hands at the foot of the bed that quickly and deftly slid off the mattress onto the floor. I moved back as much as possible and began to catch my breath, covering my mouth with my hand. I was fearful and curious at the same time. I cautiously crept to the edge of the bed and lowered my head to look at the floor and under the bed. In the pitch-black darkness under the bed, I found nothing. I rubbed my forehead, sighing deeply with relief that I had just imagined it. But it only seemed that way at first. Unexpectedly, I heard a step in the hallway. It was unhurried, and judging by the sound, was headed toward my bedroom. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I stared intently at the door, afraid to move. There was a sudden thumping sound, as if something had run toward my room. I immediately jumped off the bed and slammed the door shut just as it reached the entrance. I pressed against the door, eyes squeezed shut, pushing with all my might to keep it out. It was quiet on the other side. Only the clock could be heard. Then the ticking suddenly stopped. Everything went completely silent. I relaxed my face and began to listen. Suddenly, there was a blow to the door, and something began to break in. Whatever stood on the opposite side began to violently rattle the handle. I held it and soon locked it, turning the key. It wouldn't stop, pounding louder and louder each time. I backed away from the door, my back approaching the bed. My Dalton, surprisingly, was still sleeping through all of this, as if the noise didn't bother him, as if he didn't notice it. Meanwhile, the blows stopped, and a quiet, creaky voice came from behind the door. "Knock, knock," it said. It began to tap lightly on the door. "Knock, knock," the tapping sounded, slow and insistent. I backed away even further until my thighs hit the bed. Then something began to breathe heavily on me. I felt its breath and its rotten smell. Whatever it was taller than me. I stood frozen in fear. My hair swayed with each of its inhales and exhales. I turned around sharply, breathing rapidly. My Dalton was gone. I looked at the bed and he wasn't there. I began to search for him all over the room, calling him softly, but to no avail, as if he had vanished. In terror, I ran to the door and began to open it, when suddenly, the door of the wardrobe in my room creaked. Its doors opened slowly on their own, with the piercing screech of door hinges and the groan of old wood. There was only darkness inside the wardrobe. At first, nothing was visible, until a bony, charred hand emerged from the darkness of the furniture and pointed its finger at me. At the same moment, the door behind me opened, and the one who stood behind it began to watch me, while I stood staring at the wardrobe. Something placed its hand on my shoulder. It was very thin, like the hand from the wardrobe. The fingers had long, unkempt, dirty nails with bits of earth under them. It ran its fingers over my shoulder. In my head, I began to hear only one thing: "This is the end." My thoughts were interrupted by what stood behind me. In a quiet, raspy voice, the thing whispered, "Knock, knock."